Welcome to my dad's car. Enjoy!
Welcome to My Dad's Car, a podcast discussing our personal relationship with automotive nostalgia. And you know what? It doesn't even have to be about your dad's car. It can be your mum's, your grand's, your parents', guardians, or even a neighbour's. If it made an impression, let's talk about it. Hello.
Hello. How you doing? All right?
Yeah, we're okay. You?
Not too bad. Not too bad.
We're in season 4 now, John.
Yeah, who'd have thought it? It's going along quite well, isn't it?
I think so. Yeah, we're sort of gathering momentum, and we're probably now putting stuff out a month and a half in advance, something like that, or recording and then putting it out a month and a half in advance. Yeah, nice to get that. Yeah, another milestone under our belt, really.
Yeah.
Hi, guys.
How you doing, Steve? You all right?
Yeah.
Perfect. We're straight into it. This is very efficient. Thank you very much. Quick benefit of the tape. I think I reached out to you, Steve. Either you'd followed us or I saw your account kind of on someone we knew, and it just looked like you kind of did some interesting stuff.
Yeah.
And I sort of reached out to you when we got chatting, and it sounded like you did do some interesting stuff and you might have some interesting stories. So do you want to give us a quick rundown of what you get up to?
Yeah. Okay. Well, the day job and my hobby are probably completely different ends of the spectrum, really. So let's get the day job bit out the way, I guess, first. So the day job is I'm actually the company historian for Aston Martin Lagonda.
Okay.
So I've worked for Aston for a long time. I joined in 1990. I escaped for 3 years and then came back. So I think this time round it'll be about 14 years this year and about 16 and a half or so before that. So to call it about 30 odd years of service, you know.
Yeah.
And then really as I kind of got older, I suddenly realised I was, you know, people asking me questions all the time at work about the good old days. And so I kind of eased into the role of historian, really. First of all, I did it alongside my other previous job, which was looking after customers when they were coming in to order cars at the factory. And then after the pandemic, it became a full-time job.
Oh, nice.
And this year will be like the 4th year, you know, in the role full-time. And yeah, it's great fun. You know, it's really good fun looking at old cars and talking about old cars and actually cars that aren't that old. You know, as soon as we don't make something, it comes over to me to kind of look after it. So yeah, it kind of starts in 1913 and goes right the way up to date. So yeah, that's the day job.
What would be we're getting diverted already, but I think it's fascinating. What's the typical sort of application for this? Is this like they'll dig up a car from a barn somewhere and want to know about it, or?
Well, I was liking this job. It's a little bit like when I used to go on holiday as a kid. Every so often there'd be a bit of excitement because a yellow helicopter would appear.
Okay.
And it would pluck a kid out of the sea that had gone out too far on a lilo, and you think, wow, look at that. They've got like a special helicopter to rescue holiday makers. So that's the bit that, you know, you kind of saw, but the real job was to pluck airmen out of the sea if the planes crashed, you know, so that was what they were practicing for. And it's a bit like this with this job. The bit that people see is me running around at car shows, or, you know, sometimes I'll feature on my social media about a car that maybe I've looked at and investigated. So that's the kind of glamorous bit, the bit that people see, but that's only a tiny, tiny little bit of it. That's plucking the kid off the lilo out the sea job, you know. So most of what I do is stuff behind the scenes, and it's feeding the business with information about the past. And, you know, we use it all the time. So if we're looking at a new model, we might want to sort of look back at a previous one and then draw comparisons to it, or we might be looking for inspiration for a model name or a name for a colour, or we need to know how many of a particular car are left so we can work out how many parts we need. So all sorts of things, really. Nowhere near as exciting as the analogy of going off and rescuing somebody, you know, which in this case is doing something really glamorous like dragging a car out of a barn, you know. But it does happen, and I have been in a few barns and I've been in some weird places with the job, and it's a lot of fun, you know.
So in complete contrast to that, your sort of weekend car is?
Yeah. Well, so I kind of thought about it, and I was looking for a classic, and I had I've had various things over the years, but the last car I had before this one was a Mazda Unos, so a Mark 1 Unos with the pop-up lights, and it just wasn't getting used. And, you know, we've got a blended family, I think they call it nowadays. We've got grandkid, we've got kids of various ages, you know, so I hardly ever had a chance to use it. And it was also a car that I'd have to tax and, you know, all the costs you have with an extra car. So I thought, well, why don't I get an old car again? Why don't I go back to a proper classic, something I can potter around to the pub in it, or go to all the local car shows, because I live in Warwickshire, right on the edge of the Cotswolds. So round here is like a kind of a posh Motown, really. There's loads of, we've got cafe in the machine, Jilt's Cafe, loads of cool stuff going on. but you kind of feel a bit of a fraud. If you turned up in a 90s car like 5 years ago, the guy on the gate would go, "Yep, the car park's that way," and you go, "No, I've come to be in the show." And they're like, "Oh, okay, how old is it then?" And I got fed up with that, so I thought, right, let's get a proper old car. So I started looking for a Morris Minor, a car that I'd never had, but as a kid we had one in the family, so I guess I'm jumping the gun a bit on this one. But anyway, so I thought looking for a Moggy, and I was really underwhelmed by all the cars I looked at. They were patchwork quilts and dodgy welding and, cars that have got no shine on the paint. And I thought, no, I can't spend £5,000 on a Morris Minor and it not look amazing. So I decided to look for something different. And I literally went onto eBay, typed in classic car, 20 miles or whatever it was, and up comes an Allegro. And as soon as I saw this little Allegro and I read the description, and I thought, can I get away with driving an Austin Allegro? How would people react to that?
Yeah.
I've a wicked sense of humour, so I thought that would be really funny. I could turn up at all sorts of things in this. Why go and have something that's a little bit rubbish? Why just get the worst car ever made, allegedly, and be completely opposite end of the spectrum to the day job? So that's what I did. So I went and looked at the car, and I could see that there was a fairly good history, but I thought, I bet I could have some fun with this. I bet I could investigate my own car and go and find some of the bits that are missing, so that appealed to me. So next thing you know, I was dragging my dad along to come and have a look at it with me as well on another occasion. And it was quite funny because I'd had an Allegro as an ordinary car back in the 80s.
Okay.
And the last time I'd bought that, my dad went with me. So we did the same thing again, like however many years later. And he said, well, it looks all right to me, go for it. So I did. So I bought the car, and I've had so much fun with it, but not in a way that you'd have fun in a sports car, going out for a blast on a Sunday morning or whatever. It's obviously not that sort of car, but wherever you go in it, it just causes conversations.
Yeah.
So the kind of the opposite extreme, really. I've also jump started an Aston with it, which is also hilariously funny. So yeah, lots and lots of fun with it, and it's become like a sidekick. People now, first thing they'll say to me is, "How's the Allegro?" And I'm like, yeah, it's okay, thanks, but can we not talk about your DB5 for a minute, or whatever it is? So it's just really weird that the first thing that comes out of people's mouths is, "How's the Allegro?" So yeah, I've got to a point now where I can't really get rid of it, because if I get rid of it, I'll spend the rest of my life explaining why I got rid of it. So I might as well just keep it, really, just be easier,
Yeah.
Shall we bring ourselves back on topic?
Yeah, sorry, I do this all the time.
No, it was wonderful. We'll keep it all in. I think it's great. What's your earliest car or earliest motoring memory?
Well, my first word was car. I think I said that before I said mum or dad. And the first car that my dad had was an Austin Cambridge.
Okay.
So an A55 Cambridge, which was a two-tone.
Nice.
I think it was either white or a very pale dove grey over like a turquoise blue. So the rear fins were like a turquoise sort of blue colour. And that's what Dad had, and he loved it. And he'd got a few little bits he'd done to it to make it a little bit nicer.
Okay.
So it had a Philips radio. So one early memory is sitting in the back of the car at night time, and they'd have Radio Luxembourg on. So that's about the only thing you could find at night time on medium wave or whatever, long wave, whatever it was, where it actually played pop music, and all you could see was this tiny little green light kind of glowing to show the radio was on.
Yeah.
Because in those days, nothing lit up, did it? You didn't have the dash all lit up. So I always remember like looking at this little green light as we were driving along. And yeah, so I have lots of memories of that car. And also it had a chrome horn push, like the old horn ring, on the steering wheel.
Yeah.
Which, even then at a young age, I mean, it must have been only probably, as I remember things like that, probably 2 or 3. But I was sitting on my dad's lap and I'd look at the steering wheel,
Are they bench seat in the front, those?
Yeah, like a split bench.
Yeah.
The backrest was split, and then the rest of it, I think, was one piece.
Yeah.
Or maybe 2 very close together. I can't quite remember that far. So my dad's one was an A55 Marina Cambridge, and my granddad had an A60 or equivalent. It was a Morris rather than an Austin. So it would be a Morris Oxford Mark 6 or whatever it was at the time.
Okay.
So in other words, the little bit later shape without the rear fins on it. And that was a dark blue one, I seem to remember. So those were the 2 first cars I really remember seeing and actually going out in. And then my granddad then went on to a Marina. So he had 2 Marinas, one after the other, which lasted years, actually. And then after the Marina, my dad convinced him into buying a brand new car, and he bought an F-Reg Metro, I think it would have been a City or something, in Hearing Aid beige. And then that was it. That lasted him until he wasn't around anymore,
He stitched him up there, didn't he?
Well, my dad was fed up with welding the Marina, but dad was like, oh God, every year he'd have to do like MOT welding on it. And I think he put a pair of front wings on it. And the car was always looked amazing. They were always polished. And
Yeah.
my grandfather was ex-army, so everything was polished, and he always wore a tie every day and that sort of thing. So the Marina was always polished, but it was, rusting away underneath. So my dad convinced him to buy this Metro. But funny enough, before the Metro finally happened, my dad was trying to persuade him to look at something more modern. So one weekend came home in a Maestro.
Yep.
So my dad worked in the car trade as well, and occasionally they'd get cars in for sale.
Yeah.
And somehow this kind of opalescent green Maestro Vanden Plas of all things appears.
Wow.
With the talking dash, and so we went out. The idea was to take them out for Sunday lunch in it and hope that my nan would say, oh, this is really nice, let's get one of these, but for whatever reason it backfired. It didn't quite work, but we had a nice weekend in a Maestro. And then my dad sort of shouting at it because he couldn't work out how to turn off the computer, because you go around a corner, it would tell you that the fuel was low or something, and then eventually discovered there was a volume control. But of course we all thought it was amazing because it had a digital dashboard in it. Yeah, so that was my Grandad.
Sounds like there's quite a strong allegiance to British produced cars then, Steve.
Yeah, and it comes partly from my grandfather. My grandfather was a chauffeur. He was a butler and a chauffeur.
Wow.
After the war, and he worked for a lady in a big house outside of London, a place called Trent Park.
Okay.
And he worked for a lady called Hannah Gubby, and she was a distant relative of the Queen.
Good stuff.
So when they had the coronation, she said, right, you need to drive me to Westminster Abbey or wherever it was.
Yeah.
But the car was a Morris Minor. She was like agoraphobic. She didn't like, I think that's a word, big wide open spaces. And although they had a big Daimler, they never used it. She would always prefer to drive in the Morris. So they had a Morris Minor, and I think they had an A30 before that.
Fair enough.
But my grandfather still used to wear the chauffeur's hat. So you can imagine all this row of black limousines outside the Abbey, and then there's this one little Morris Minor, but everybody wearing the same uniform, So that was quite cool. So my granddad always liked cars, and my dad and I, we worked together for a while, and sometimes at lunchtime we would drive over and see him for lunch, and we would go in a car that was being road tested. And we used to work for a garage that did Rolls Royce and Bentleys, so sometimes we'd turn up in an old Rolls or something, and he'd always come out and inspect it.
Yeah.
Right, let's come and look at this car then, and he'd come out and have a look at it. So yeah, he always took an interest in motoring and in cars in general, and I think that rubbed off on my dad really, and then of course on to me.
Fantastic. Yeah, I picked up on the British Leyland thing. What was it about the Metro that kind of ticked the boxes that the Maestro didn't tick?
Yeah, probably because he was quite sort of straight talking, and he didn't do anything frivolous. And also, my nan and granddad, or even though the whole time I knew them, they never worked in service, but they still had this subservient way about them. And they thought, oh, no, you can't drive a posh car, because the people in the big house won't like that. So I think they always knew their place in life and didn't want to be seen driving anything bigger than they needed.
Okay.
So the Metro was deemed to be big enough. It was one of the facelifted Metros, so it would have been an F-Reg. And I remember it being beige. I can't remember if it was a special edition. It was quite smart, and it had a pop-up sunroof, but it was beige.
Yeah.
And he would turn up in it wearing his Grenadier Guards tie and a blazer.
Nice.
And booming out of the radio or out the cassette player would be like a brass band, like a big military band, and he'd be like, here he comes. And that was my granddad. And of course, all of the cars he had and lights were Leyland or previous BMC brands. He used to say all the time that he didn't like Fords, and the reason he didn't like Fords was the first car he bought was a Y-type, so a side valve Ford, a 30s Y-type, and he said it was unreliable and it was all this, that and the other, so that put him off of Ford for the rest of his life.
Fair enough.
So he always used to have a British Leyland or BMC type car, and then that kind of rubbed off on us as well. My dad was the same. He preferred BL cars to Fords. So thankfully, we used to have a caravan, which meant we had a fairly big car to pull it. So the cars I remember growing up with that my dad had, as in the name of the podcast, were Triumph 2000s.
Okay.
So there were actually two Mark II 2000s and then a Cortina in between. And then we went back, thankfully, to a Triumph 2000 500S, which was a really nice bit of kit. But the only problem was, the cars were company cars, but they weren't brand new because it was a garage. They'd just buy something and we'd end up with it. And there was no choice of what we got. When the right type of car turned up, we got it. So the 2500 was a honeysuckle beige colour. which, was looking a little bit old-fashioned in the early 80s.
Yeah.
So the car would have been an S-Reg, and this must have been when I was 8 or 9. So it was probably about 1980, 81, and everybody else's dad had got a Cortina Mark V or whatever, but we had this Triumph. But we liked it and it sounded good. But of course it was rusting away, as everything did back then. And the big joke was the first owner was British Steel. So the very people that created the stuff that was going rusty were the first owners. But of course I used to wash it and polish it for him. And that's how I got into working on cars initially, was cleaning cars and making tea. And I started working with my dad, I think when I was about 11.
Okay.
I used to go on a Saturday morning and go in and wash cars and make tea, sweep up, that sort of thing. And then gradually, because it was a car restoration shop, I got involved in like paint stripping and all the nasty jobs, really. But also got taught how to use a spray gun.
Oh, cool.
And we used to make repair panels. So my job on a Saturday morning was to lay all the panels out that I'd made in a week and then paint them. So spray them with red oxide primer. And I'd have to go in the corner of the spray booth or wherever there was a bit of room to lay these things out. And on one occasion, my dad said, you're going to have to go outside. There's no room in here. So use the old oil barrel. So I got this old big massive barrel that I'd laid the panels on. And I was outside with the airline of the gun spraying away. And suddenly it started snowing.
Oh, no.
So I tapped on the window and my dad appeared and went, what? And I went, it's snowing. He went, oh, you better come in then. And it was like, don't tell your mum, so everything was like, don't tell your mum, so don't tell your mum how dangerous all the things you've been doing at work are, because no health and safety back then, so yeah, there were snowflakes on at least one panel that I painted. But yeah, it was really good fun. I loved it. And that's where I developed a passion for classic cars, really working amongst these mainly 1950s cars. And occasionally we'd get something coming in that wasn't a Rolls or a Bentley. So things like a Triumph Stag, and we had a brand new Lotus Esprit Turbo turned up to have the decals put on the front of it.
Oh, nice.
So for whatever reason, the guy bought it brand new and they hadn't put the big Lotus reef on the front, so my dad had to do that. Yeah, so we did get to see all sorts of really cool cars in that period.
Yeah.
But then, of course, all the ordinary cars that were coming and going are now the cars that we see as being classic cars, We used to look after the St John's ambulance next door, which was an old Bedford CF ambulance. And so, yeah, there were lots of ordinary cars coming and going, and we had a petrol station. So cars would come in for fuel.
Okay. Do you have to go out and fill them up?
Yeah. So my job was serving petrol. Most people would come in and say, fill it up, and you'd fill it up. And one guy would come in and say, I want 40 litres. Exactly. I was like, what's a litre? I mean, we didn't know what a litre was back then. So you have to watch the other gauge on the pump, And I remember once being really impressed by watching this guy pulled up. He got an XJS V12 and he went, fill it. So I went, okay. And he stood there in his camel coat and looking really cool.
Nice.
And there I am putting the petrol in and I'm watching the noughts going round. And I thought, bloody hell, it's going to run out in a moment. It got to like 50 quid. And then in those days, the pump would stop, because it was like, you don't really want any more, do you? And he went, no, keep going. So I carried on. And he just sort of like nonchalantly came into the office and signed for the fuel on his account and just went, thanks very much, and walked off. And I thought, wow, he's just done over 50 quid in petrol, That was a huge amount of money back then.
You could buy cars, couldn't you, for less?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And he got in his Jag, watching go up the road with this big kind of like vapor trail coming out of the tailpipes as it was burning off the first sort of gallon, But yeah, so things like that was like, wow, amazing. Big V12 Jag, and the bloke just didn't blink an eyelid at how much fuel it was going to guzzle,
What did he do? Did you find out anything else about him?
Well, I guess he must have been the chairman of this printing company. And they had some really, this is in the 80s, don't forget. This is probably about mid-80s. So in the background on the radio, you've got the Human League blaring out, things like that. So we're properly, like Stranger Things, but in real life.
Yeah.
And then there's all these cars coming and going. And the cars that company had, they had a BMW 325i, which was, again, wow, amazing. And the guy who drove that looked like James Bond. He looked like Roger Moore. And he'd be stood there, an absolute gale blowing, and nothing would be out of place. There wouldn't be a single hair out of place, And then there was another woman who drove a white Golf GTI convertible.
Nice.
All color-coded, which was pretty amazing. And then I think the other people who worked in the company had things like Escorts and Sierras, but they all would have been, fairly new cars, and like the Reps and people like that. So yeah, there were some really cool customers in the local village that came in. We had a magistrate who was a lady who was always drunk, so she couldn't get out of the car. So I often wonder how many people had the license took off somebody that was never ever sober when she drove, and her son had a fire engine. And he collected fire engines, old fire engines. So he'd turn up in a fire engine, as you do,
Yeah.
We had another company that they had the Lotus S4E, and then that went, and there was an XJS convertible appeared, brand new one.
Yeah.
And he had an ex-wife, and she used to drive a Land Rover. But you could tell she was very horsey, always dressed up for going off to see the horses. And she drove this battered old Series 3 Land Rover.
Okay.
But she obviously had, help yourself to fuel. It was obviously part of the arrangement. So there was always like, fill it up, and the jerry can as well, so obviously making him pay every penny. So that was always quite funny. And her daughter had come in and flirt with us and all that sort of stuff, so that was quite funny. And then he had an old 2-door Range Rover Vogue.
Nice.
Before it became a model, I think it was like a limited edition.
Yeah.
And I think she'd had it, and he had it back off her. And the reason being that he bought a boat, and he wanted to tow this boat out to Mallorca, so across land, And the idea was to make the Range Rover fit for a one-way journey. So in other words, it didn't matter what condition it would be in when it got there, it just had to drag a 3.5-ton trailer and boat across Europe. So we had this thing in, and must have serviced it and done every job we could think of to make it fit for the journey. And that was it. We never saw it ever again. So yeah, there were lots of funny moments back then with the local cars coming and going. And that was all before I joined Aston, which was in 1990.
So going back to your traveling around in your parents' cars or your dad's car, did your mum drive as well or not?
Yeah. So that was a big thing, because back then most of the mums didn't drive. When I was a kid.
Okay.
And if you had somebody had a mum who could drive, well, that opened up all sorts of opportunities. That meant you could all go to the Wimpy for someone's birthday, because the mum could drive,
Yeah.
So my mum, she learnt to drive in about, I'd have been about 4 or 5. And the car that my dad bought her was a Reliant Regal.
A three-wheel van.
Yeah, exactly. But the saloon version with the reverse back window. And that's what she learnt to drive with and had as her first car. And then it must have only been about a year or so later, my dad found a Morris Minor convertible for sale in the paper, and he went and bought it for about 200 quid and then fully restored it for her.
Okay.
So it was a 1955 Series 2 split windscreen minor convertible.
Nice.
And it was black, red leather. But my dad always had to change things a little bit. So he painted the wheel. And the same with our bikes, actually. If we had a new bike, we'd tell him what we wanted and he'd get one and paint it whatever colour we wanted. So that was our sort of life back then. So the Moggy had maroon wheels. The grille slats were painted maroon as well.
Okay.
So that was obviously non-standard, but it kind of really looked quite smart, looked good on the car. And it had a kind of maroon colour roof. But it had a 1098 engine in it. So my dad took the late 03 out of it and put a 1098 A series in there.
Yeah.
And as a result, if we ever went to a car show, you'd say, "Oh, come on, Dad, open the bonnet." He'd go, No, it's not original. I'm not opening the bonnet. He was really like, nope, no one's looking at it. Don't want to get this for having a non-original car. Because back then, if you went to a car show, most things were just as they were built. It was all about originality. And the car was, at that point, 20 years old, so it was kind of morphing from being an old car into what was the classic car scene as it was getting going in the early 70s, really. And one day we went along to this car show at, I think it was Stamford Hall, and it was called the Morris Minor Owners Club. And I think it was the first ever Morris Minor Owners Rally. And we were there as kids, with about, I don't know how many cars were there, but there was a number of cars lined up. So yeah, we were kind of, as a family, we were right in the beginning of what is now known as the kind of classic car movement.
Yeah.
And in those days, you could buy a magazine called Thoroughbred and Classic Cars, and that was pretty much it. There weren't all the other publications that we've got now.
No.
So yeah, I kind of grew up with that. And then by the time I was at that age in the 80s, when I was tinkering with stuff, then I was an avid reader of practical classics. That was my absolute Bible. That was where I knew I could read about cars that I could maybe one day buy myself.
Yeah.
But I'd also read the Classic Car magazine as well for the more glamorous stuff, So yeah, I was right at that early age. I was into cars that I knew I could one day have, but also interested in the cars that I was working on,
Were you an only child, or have you got siblings? A few of you rolling around in the back of the Reliant?
Well, yeah, I've got a younger brother, 2 years younger than me.
Yeah.
And he doesn't do cars at all.
Okay.
He absolutely doesn't do cars. His son does, and it's quite funny because he always says, "I've got your son." So Louis really should be mine. Louis is a big classic car man, but they live in the middle of nowhere in Belgium.
Okay.
So poor old Louis doesn't get a chance to see a lot of cars. So when they come to England, we always try and do stuff with Louis and show him things. And my dad's still got an old car as well. He's got an MGB.
Oh, fantastic.
So yeah, so we always make sure Louis gets to go out in one of the older cars. But it looks like it's going to go into another generation in the family, which would be great. You know, I know that grandfather would love that if he could see that, you know.
Yeah.
So Tony and I would be in the back of the Morris, you know, no seat belts, of course.
Naturally.
I don't ever remember wearing a seatbelt as a kid. They weren't invented really. So we were in the back, and the heater in a Morris Minor wasn't particularly brilliant. It was like a biscuit barrel that was underneath the dashboard.
Yeah.
And it just had a single knob that apparently just turned it up and down, but it never did anything other than make a noise, really. It's more like a pebble polisher, if you remember one of those. So it would make a funny clattering noise. And occasionally you might feel a little whiff of heat if you were right on top of the air vent.
That was the wiring.
Yeah, probably the wiring burning out. But there was no heat in the back whatsoever. So my mum knitted a blanket. So we had like a knitted blanket in the back of the car, which if it was cold, that was what we wrapped around ourselves to keep warm, you know.
And you said it was a cabriolet, is that right?
Yeah.
So there's wind getting in from every direction. It's like the worst tent you've ever been in.
Yeah, everywhere. Oh, yeah. It was always drafty. You could feel the draft around your neck. But to be fair, you know, I love that car. And when I passed my driving test, my dad said, "Go on then, take the Morris and go out for half an hour. Don't do anything silly, and then come straight back."
Yeah.
So, yeah, of course. And in those days, you couldn't text your mate and say, "I'm on my way." So I just thought, I hope he's in, and then shot down to my mate's house, bip, 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 you know, on the horn, bang, bang, bang on the door. He comes running out. He knew, obviously, that I took the test, and he was waiting to see what the result would be.
Yeah.
So he jumps in, quickly unreleased the hood, dropped the hood back, you know, and then off we went, dashing around the village in this thing with the roof down, literally a lap of the village, then back, dropped him off, put the roof back up, and straight back home before anybody had missed me, you know. So that was my first ever solo in a car, you know, or legally anyway. I might have occasionally drifted onto the main road at work, because where we worked, we had a forecourt, and my job used to be to help put the cars away at night time.
Yeah.
And sometimes, accidentally on purpose, I'd overshoot the forecourt and then have to drive up the road, turn around and come back. So I had driven on the highways, but without a license, but only just moving cars around. So driving the Moggy was the first solo, really.
What happened to that car in the end, Steve? Go on for a while, or?
Yeah, so we had it for a while, and then again, my mum had a Metro, so my dad said, "Right, I think it's time. You know, the Morris is getting on a bit. You need a more modern car." So we had a D-Reg Metro, which would have been probably about 3 years old, and it had come from the Channel Islands.
Okay.
Been a rental car, so very, very low mileage, like 4,000 miles on it or something.
Yeah.
And so she had that, and then the Morris was then laid up in the neighbour's garage, and then occasionally would come out for a quick blast around the block, but pretty much didn't really move for a while. I was going to buy it myself, and then suddenly I was shown a car, or somebody at work said, "I've got this Ford Pop."
Okay.
And it's really original, and he was going to hot rod it, but as soon as he realised it had got the original engine in it, he changed his mind. So if you want to buy it, it's 200 quid. So I ended up buying this Ford Pop, which was a Ford 100E Popular, so like the square shaped one. And so because of that meant I couldn't have the Morris as well. So I ended up letting the Morris go.
Fair enough.
So I bought that when I was 16. So I think I've just left school, and I'd been fixing up lawnmowers, painting them up, selling them for 50 quid.
Yeah.
So I'd sold enough lawnmowers and had enough money to buy the Ford. And I always remember we would go back at lunchtime to go and fiddle with this thing to get it to run, because at first time I saw it, it wasn't a runner. So we managed to get this thing up and running, which involved a fairy liquid bottle and a pipe, because there was no fuel from the back of the car.
Nice.
So we managed to rig this thing up, and we drove it during one lunchtime from the village down the road to the village where the garage was. And we pulled onto the forecourt, and it was like a patchwork quilt. It had been brush painted silver on the two-tone sort of section. Front wings were black. There was rust everywhere. So all the guys in the workshop came out to have a laugh and have a look. And everybody was jeering and laughing. And suddenly my dad just appeared. And my dad was really cool. Everybody else wore brown coloured overalls, but my dad wore white ones because he was the boss. So he comes out, and he's like Clint Eastwood. He's got like a cigar in his mouth, and he just sees the car and he goes, you know, takes a big long draw on a cigar. and everybody is just looking at him. Everybody stops laughing. They're all looking at him, and he just goes, just blows the smoke out and just shakes his head slowly and walks away. And I'm like, I think that's a yes. And that was it. He knew that there was no way he could talk me out of it. So unfortunately for him, that was coming home basically. And it was delivered on the back of a Ford Transit 3-litre car transporter. So really kind of rough looking thing, this. And the engine that had gone into it was the engine that was going to go into the pop. So the story was the V6 engine that this guy had got was going to go into the 100E, and then when he opened the bonnet, saw the side valve, stuck the engine into the very vehicle that was going to deliver it and drop it on the driveway, you know. So yeah, that was that. And then for the next year or so, my dad and I restored the car at home, or rather my dad did while I watched him, really, if I'm being honest. I did all the labouring and my poor old dad lay underneath this thing with it spitting, you know, it's like brazing and welding it all back together, and it was weld and stuff all spitting all over him. And he'd just like shake his head and look at me every now and again. But it was fantastic. He did a lovely job on it. Painted it at home as well, sprayed it at home, but to, like, you know, flat and polished like a Rolls Royce would be, you know. So it did look amazing when it was finished. And then basically I had that on the road for only a few months. And then one day another car trader came in and said that he'd got this Ford Consul and he didn't know what it was worth. Would I go and have a look at it for him? And I was only about 18 at the time. So I went over to look at this car and looked at it and thought, wow, that looks amazing. It was a big black Mark 1 Consul, red leather, column shift gear change, and it had got about 19,000 miles on the clock. So it was a real time warp car, you know. And in the end, one thing led to another, and I decided to buy it. So for 1,250 quid, I bought this Consul. So we had to sell the 100E, and then the Connie was my sort of second car.
So in hindsight, Steve, do you wish you kept the Morris?
Oh yeah, of course, yeah. I mean, I wish I'd bought the Morris. I wish I'd kept all of them. And the Ford was great.
Yeah.
The 100E was really underpowered. I mean, if you've ever driven one, they are so. It's only got 3 gears, and being a Ford of that era, so the gearbox is like first, second, and fourth. So you've got nothing in between. And you can't really rev it that much. So you're trying to get any real momentum going was quite tricky. And I also reverted it back to vacuum-powered wipers because I thought it'd be original. But I realised why it had been converted to electric, because when you went up a hill, the wipers stopped. The more you accelerated and the more the engine laboured, the more they slowed down until they stopped completely. But that didn't matter because you were going so slowly. It didn't really matter if anything was in front of you because you were never going to hit anything because you weren't going that fast. So yeah, it was a great little car, and I wish I'd kept it. But actually, the Consul was a much better car for an 18-year-old to be rocking around in.
Yeah.
And then I got a girlfriend. So I had a girlfriend who lived in Leicester, and that was quite a commute between where I lived and Leicester. So my dad said, you know what, you need to get yourself a runaround, really.
Yeah.
And then keep the Consul for the weekends. And that's what really led to this Allegro, which was being sold by somebody we knew, 450 quid, I think it was. And so my dad said, well, let's go and have a look at it, you know. So we went down to look at this thing. And again, it was beige. It had a vinyl roof on it, but the vinyl had faded. So it looked like a leather jacket. And at that time, a very popular fashion thing was like these kind of dark tan coloured leather jackets that were like a motley effect.
Sort of stonewashed almost, weren't they?
Yeah, that's it. Like like that, but on leather.
Yeah, my dad had one, I'm sure.
Well, my vinyl roof was like that.
I think Curly Watts had one in Coronation Street in sort of late 80s, early 90s.
That's it. You're right. Yeah, you're
right.
It's
worth a Google if anyone wants to know what that is.
We'll have to have a look at that. And so my vinyl roof was like that. So it had this kind of quite cool looking mottled vinyl roof. One of the selling features of the car was it had a sticker in the back window and it said Evening Telegraph, to the local newspaper, and the logo on the newspaper was Evening Telegraph, it's right up your street. But the guy selling it to me, who was probably in his 20s, had peeled off some of the letters, so it said up yours on the back of the car. And it was like, look at that. And I'm like, oh yeah, wow. You know, so that was like a selling feature of this car. And because it drove all right, you know, 450 quid change hands, and that was my modern day car, you know. It actually drove all right. The only problem was it smoked like a Red Arrow's jet. So if I went down a road and put my foot down, the smoke coming out the back, that'd be like a curly kind of vapor trail, like a Red Arrow's jet, but like a smoky kind of blue colour. And you could see it hanging over the road in the rear view mirror if you're on a long road. It was really, really bad.
Amusing that today that kind of smokescreen thing's so sort of synonymous with Aston Martin and James Bond, given your day job, that you were there first.
Yeah, exactly. Little did I know.
Fantastic. Yeah, thank you very much for sharing some brilliant tales with us. I think they've been some wonderful stories.
Really good.
Good stuff. Brilliant.
Really enjoyed it.
Yeah, I have a habit of talking too much, so sorry about that. But hopefully you can edit something out of it all.
Absolutely, yeah. There's a lot of good stuff in there. I think we'll keep a lot of it in.
Yeah.
It'd be fascinating to chat with you for hours and hours and hours. But
Brilliant. Well, you know where I am, so if you want to talk about something else another time, then give us a shout.
fantastic. Yeah, we really appreciate it.
Thanks, Steve.
Brilliant. Thanks ever so much. Really nice to meet you both, and best of luck with the whole thing. It's really, really good. Enjoy listening to it.
Cheers, Steve. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye.
There we go.
That's some tales there, wasn't there? Really good.
Yeah, loads of them. We ended up on some tangents, but they were good ones, weren't they?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely one of those people, Steve. You could literally talk to him all day, couldn't you? And he'd just reel off story after story.
I felt a bit bad kind of calling him to a halt, but
Yeah.
we've got other things to do today. And
Well, yeah, that's it. Yeah.
and yeah, at some point I've got to edit this.
Yeah, it's true.
So
no, it's good. It's funny, the British Leyland sort of allegiances. Some people were really kind of into it, weren't they? And would never sort of leave it for anything. Whereas I think my dad, for whatever reason, was strongly against it. Like he just wouldn't dabble with them at all for whatever reason. Maybe he got his fingers burnt or something at some point. But
yeah, I think so. Maybe it was I don't know, whether back in the day you kind of either went to a Ford garage or you went to a Rover garage, and potentially they didn't cross over. So actually, if your chosen mechanic kind of specialised in British Leyland, then you'd buy the one that the mechanic was best suited to.
Yeah. Love that old sort of throwback as well to older people sort of being prim and proper and just having a car that's big enough and don't need anything bigger than that. That's just silly.
And the
quite the opposite to modern day world, really, isn't it?
Yeah. the image of him turning up kind of in a suit or kind of a shirt and tie with a brass band playing. And this kind of juxtaposition of this tiny beige Metro.
Yeah. Look forward to seeing what AI can do with that one.
Yeah, that sounds quite funny, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Sounds almost like a Benny Hill sketch, kind of following this.
It does.
Crossed with sort of, Mr. Bean or something.
Yeah.
Yeah, very good. Nice reference for Wimpy after we kind of touched on Happy Eater the other week.
Yeah.
Or, sorry, Little Chef, didn't we?
Have you got any Wimpies around your way? I've still got a few around my neck of the woods.
Yeah, there's still one in town, yeah.
Yeah, I think I drove past one earlier in the week, funnily enough, and sort of thought it's worth a mention on the podcast at some point. And lo and behold, there it is.
I remember having a birthday party at Wimpy, actually, and they had a Mr. Wimpy. There was a character.
Was there? I didn't know that.
Like Ronald McDonald. I think he looked a bit like a Beefeater, like you get the Tower of London.
Right. McDonald's must have been fully booked, Andy, that week then or something. If you,
I did have some McDonald's ones as well, but I think the Wimpy, obviously, with the knife and fork element, maybe slightly more highbrow.
Yeah.
Wouldn't say that we were posh, but
I don't know if all the McDonald's were the same, but there was a ship in our branch.
I thought you said something else.
No, SHIP. And that was the thing. I think you'd go in and they
like an adventure playground thing.
Yeah, it had a spinning wheel. That's obviously like the golden seat to be at the wheel.
Oh, okay.
I think you got a little tour of the kitchen as well, perhaps.
I remember the McDonald's that used to have seats that looked like mushrooms.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
You sat on those, and then
it was a real treat.
Yeah, you got a tour of the kitchen, and then someone came out dressed as Ronald McDonald, sometimes the Hamburglar.
That's it. Yeah. I don't know if I kind of remember as well when Burger King launched in this country, and I think I had attended a party there.
Oh, okay.
And there was a guy, I think he was called Kid Vids.
Okay, don't recall.
And he would come out and he'd be dressed in all this ridiculous sort of 90s gear. Again, worth a Google, along with Curly Watts' jacket. Yeah, I remember that. Good times.
Fantastic. Yeah. 80s and 90s eateries.
Yeah,
some brilliant stories from Steve. Very grateful for him coming on, and a real mixture of kind of stuff between his day job, obviously for Aston Martin, and pottering around in Austin Allegros.
Yeah. I was expecting to talk about Aston Martins for half an hour, but instead we were talking about Allegros and smoky things.
A nice break from his day job,
Yeah.
and I think actually for what we do, probably more fascinating and more interesting.
Yeah.
Like, it would be interesting to know the stories behind cars he's pulled out of barns.
Definitely.
But the tales of kind of what his mum and his dad were driving, I think probably have more value.
Yeah. You could almost do a part 2, couldn't you, with Steve in a different recording?
Yeah, possibly. We'll see.
See how it goes. Yeah.
One day when we book out the Royal Albert Hall for My Dad's Car live, the 20th anniversary or something, we'll get him along to speak on stage. We'll have a brass band just for the mention of his grandfather. Cool. Okay, we'll wrap it up.
All right. I'll let you get on.
Roll the credits.
Thank you for listening to My Dad's Car. I hope you enjoyed the show. Please support us. Buy us a coffee and subscribe. And tell all your friends.